Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our study of the Guide for the Perplexed. We are at lecture number 75, and last time we started chapter 29 in book 2, which in the Pines edition, the second volume, this one, we're at page 337, and we learned a little bit of it last week, or last time we studied, and Rambam had told us in previous chapters of his idea that he agrees with Aristotle on some one point and not on the other, and that is that he agrees that the world, that the laws of nature are constant and fixed, right? And the world that exists will always exist the way we see it, right? Because the laws of physics, according to Rambam's understanding, are such that if the world exists this way, then this is the way it has to be. So then this is the way it always will be, right? And remember, the Rambam was saying that on the basis of his understanding of the laws of physics. It's almost certain that had he known, and I know I'm stepping on dangerous ground saying that what Rambam would have said, but had he known that the laws of physics dictate that at some point, several hundred billion years or whatever the time frame is, that the universe will implode, he would have believed the same thing. It just based on Aristotle's understanding of the laws of physics, the world will therefore last forever. However, the fact that he disagreed with Aristotle, taking those same rules and applying them to the past, which is that the laws of physics, because they dictate the world should exist as we see it, now it should have that same rules applied 100 years ago and 100 billion years ago on all the way on back in infinity. So therefore, there never was an actual act of creation, where the Rambam says that no, there was an actual creation, right? So because the laws of physics themselves, which dictate that the world should be this way, were created at the time of that act of creation, and therefore the creator created it, which gives the world purpose. And once we have a world with purpose, then there's a room for a Torah and so on that tells us how to fulfill that purpose. Now, all of that was in the past. But then Rambam said, and he talked about how some verses seem to indicate maybe that the world might have an end date, and Rambam is arguing that the world does not have an end date. And we'll see in the chapter that we read today that in the Rambam's mind, this idea that the world has no end date is not a religious idea. It's a scientific idea, right? It's a scientific idea, which the Rambam then says is not contradicted in the Torah or in Tanakh. It's and he believes it for the same reasons that Aristotle believed it. Okay, and you'll understand as we go through why I'm emphasizing that. Now, then he's going in this chapter 29. He's going to deal with the fact that the language of the Torah, or especially of the prophets, often seems to refer to the heavens and the earth and all the celestial beings as being temporary, as being things that can be destroyed. So as is his usual pattern, he demonstrates from some places where it's obvious to anyone with a head on his or her shoulders that clearly those verses don't actually mean what they seem to say on the surface, right? And therefore he is able to extrapolate and say that other places where it seems to indicate that the world is not forever and so on, it doesn't really mean that. Now, in the course of those discussions, the Rambam is going to touch on, and this is what's going to make today especially fun. The Rambam is going to touch on other areas in which the Torah seems to contradict the idea that the laws of science are eternal, right? Remember, Rambam is making this assumption. I know I said this a lot of times, but I'm going to say it again, and I apologize, that the laws of nature and physics are fixed. They are the way they are, and they're not going to change, which is why the Rambam believes the universe will always exist. That same assertion brings into question two major things on which religion is based. One is miracles, right? So the Rambam is going to deal with today the idea of miracles. The other thing the Rambam is going to deal with today, hopefully, I say today because I hope to finish chapter 29 today, but I don't know, we'll see if that happens, is the famous question of the contradictions between science and Bereshis as it's described in the book of Genesis. Now, if we seem to think that the contradictions between Bereshis and what we know from science are important today, when we understand the evolution of life, and we understand the the physics and how the universe came to be what it is, very differently, or at least it seems different from what the Torah seems to describe, and people always discuss the contradictions between the two. If we think that's a problem now and it wasn't a problem in Rambam's day, we're wrong, because the Rambam also had to deal with the fact, right, that his understanding of how the world, works doesn't necessarily match up with the Psukim in Bereshis. In other words, his physics of Aristotle didn't match up with what Bereshis seems to describe. So it's not a new problem, and the Rambam is going to deal with that today and a little bit. And so it's going to be a fun day, and might get some people rankled, it might get some people happy. I don't know. We'll see. But so it's going to be a fun day. So let's begin. I'm at the bottom of page 337, and remember, just to remind you, he had just made the point that often, you can listen to somebody speaking and just simply misunderstand what they're trying to say if you don't realize that they're speaking in a metaphorical way. Maybe they're speaking in aphorisms that might not be ones that you're familiar with in the culture that you're in, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so after having interpreted this language to you in a general way, and Rambam is going to he's going to bring a lot of verses from Yeshayahu, from Isaiah. Isaiah is one of the most poetic, and Rambam deliberately chooses Isaiah as his primary example of a poet, waxing poetic about the heavens and the skies and the suns and the stars and the moons and earthquakes and mountains moving and flying. Isaiah talks in language like that because he's a poet and he's dramatic. He's full of drama. That's why people love to read him. But obviously, he doesn't mean that mountains are going to be flying and heavens are going to be crashing and so on. So the Rambam is going to be talking about that in the next few paragraphs. So it should be interesting. So after having interpreted this language to you in a general way, I shall show you the correctness of this interpretation and the demonstration thereof. Remember, when Rambam uses this word that Pines is translating as demonstration, that's a very strong word. That means a proof, right? That means the Rambam is saying that's rock solid. You can't argue with me on this one, right? An interpretation, right? You can argue with the Rambam and say, hey, I don't like your interpretation. But when the Rambam says something is a demonstration, that's the equivalent of saying it's scientifically proven. It's just a fact. So in other words, if you're going to try to tell me that Isaiah meant some of his things literally, then you're just simply wrong. Okay? That's when he uses the word demonstration. When God had given Isaiah, peace be upon him, prophetic inspiration regarding the fall of the Babylonian dynasty, the destruction of Sancherib and Nebuchadnezzar, right, who rose up after. Remember, the time that Isaiah was saying most of his prophecies at that time, right, it was a time when the Assyrian Empire was the most powerful empire. Soon in the future, after Isaiah was going to leave the scene, obviously, the Babylonian Empire was going to conquer the Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrian Empire was going to go to the dustbin of history. The Babylonian Empire was going to ascend. And then eventually the Babylonian Empire was going to get conquered by the Persians, right? And the Babylonian Empire. But however, in the interim, before the Babylonian Empire gets conquered, it was going to destroy Judea, the people of Judah. So Isaiah was prophesying about these events that were going to be in the future and the end of his kingdom. When that prophet began to describe the disaster that befell them at the end of their reigns, their defeats and the misfortunes that came upon them, and were such misfortunes as come upon all the defeated who flee the victory of the sword, right? He said the following verse: "For the stars of heaven." I'm going to read this from inside. So let me pull up in Isaiah 13. Just give me 1 second so you can hear the words in Hebrew. Hold on 1 minute. Okay, so Isaiah 13:10. Here's the things. Ki kochvei hashamayim uchzilehem lo yahelu oram. The stars and constellations of heaven shall not give off their light. Choshech hashemesh so. The sun will be dark when it rises. V'yoreach lo yagia oro. And the moon shall no longer shine its light. And then it keeps going a little bit later. Al kain shamayim argiz, that I will shake up the heavens. V'tirash haaretz mimakoma, and the earth will shake from its place. Be'evrat Adonai Tzavos, because of the anger of the Lord God. V'yom charon hapo, on the day of his anger. So those are the Rambam is quoting Yeshayahu, who's predicting the fall of the mighty empire of Assyria. Now, in the time of Yeshayahu, he's saying this when Assyria is a mighty empire, and to say this is pretty gutsy, right? That he's predicting their fall, but because so it's a it's a prophecy. So, but he chooses language which one in a simple-minded person would say, "Oh my goodness, Isaiah is telling us the sun's going to stop giving light, the moon's going to stop shining." The word, I mean, but who in their right mind is anyone in this room now truly believe that Isaiah actually meant that the sun is going to stop shining? But rather, I do not think, Rambam says, that there has been anyone in whom ignorance, blindness, and the inclination to adhere to the external sense of figurative expressions and of rhetorical speeches. I can't think that anyone who's so stupid, but so blind and so wedded to the actual meaning of the actual words, that he would reach such a point that he thought that the stars in the heaven and the light of the sun and the moon have been changed when the king of Babylon came to an end, right? No one reading this thinks that Isaiah is telling us that God's going to destroy Babylon and the sun's going to stop rising in the morning, right? I don't know. Does anyone in this room think that? No, of course not. No, nobody thinks that, right? Or the earth was removed from its center. It's merely a description. He's using these terms to describe that he's put to flight, right? The Babylonian king is going to run. Like the thing that we think is powerful, like the sun, is going to stop rising in the morning, right? That's what it's coming to say. He sees all light as black, like the world was bright with the shine of my mighty empire, and now it's darkened, right? This is Isaiah speaking as a poet speaks, right? Finds everything that is sweet bitter, and imagines that the earth has narrowed for him and that the heavens are closed over him. Similarly, when he began to describe the state of extreme humiliation and servitude to which Israel would be reduced during the time of the wicked Sancheir, remember Yeshayahu was just before the destruction of the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel, which was destroyed at the hands of Sancherib, who was the Assyrian general. So he describes that take the people captive and put them to flight. So he describes them. I should pull up Isaiah 36 so long so I can read it again. It's always nice to read Isaiah in the original. Just give me 1 minute.
I'll just say this, maybe even off the record.
Yeah.
Maimonides had an advantage that those that he's calling stupid won't read his book either.
That's true. Okay. Yeah, but right. So well, I don't know. Some of us might. I don't know. I don't know if we qualify as stupid, but okay. Yeah. Anyway, so terror and the pit and the trap upon thee, O inhabitant of the earth. Right. That's Isaiah 36:1. So that would be by wait. I'm sorry, no, that's 24. I apologize. I have to go to Isaiah 24. Let me read it inside. It's just that Yeshayahu's language is so beautiful. It's a shame to read it not in its original. So I apologize. Give me a second. 24:17. Okay, here we are. Pachad v'fachas v'fach. This is language you can't match Yeshayahu's language. Terror and the pachad. The pachad is so the rhymes of these words you can't translate them. Reading them in English is just it's crime almost. Pachad v'fachat v'fach alecha yoshev aretz will fall upon you, those that dwell in the land. He's talking about the terrible disaster, terror and pits and traps is what's going to fall upon the people that inhabit the land, right? And it shall come to pass, and we'll continue reading, that he who fleeth from the noise of the terror, right? In his words, let's read like this: when he's the chafra halavana, and then he ends with the last verse there, 23. The chafra halavana, the moon will be ashamed, ubosha hachama, and the sun will be embarrassed. Ki malach Adonai tzvaos b'har Tzion v'Yerushalayim, because God will reign on the Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, v'neged zakenim of kavod, right? And the presence of God will be revealed to his zakenim, to the elders that are faithful with him. So does anyone really think, right at the conclusion of this passage, Rambam says, when he began to describe what God would do to Sancherib, the destruction of his proud kingdom before Jerusalem, and the shame that God would cause him to suffer there. He said, speaking in parables, like I just read to you, the moon shall be confounded, and the sun shall be ashamed, right? Right? And so on. Jonas and Menazeel had given a very good interpretation, saying that when that which was going to come to pass before Jerusalem after Sancheiriv, the idolaters would know that that was a divine act and would be astonished and confused. For he, may peace be upon him, says, they who worship the moon will be ashamed, etc., and so on. So the bottom line is, does anyone really think that anything's going to change about the moon? Right? Did anybody look back in history and say, oh, Isaiah was wrong because when the Sancheiriv conquered Israel, the moon didn't disappear, right? Nobody in the right mind is going to say that, because they know that Isaiah was using imagery, right? He used imagery to bring out to portray a point. So again, and when he began to describe how great shall be the stable security of Israel after the destruction of Sancheiriv, as well as the fertility and cultivation of their lands and the good fortune of the dynasty brought about by Chizkiyahu, right? He said, speaking in parables, that the light of the sun and the moon would increase. I mean, does anybody look back and see if the sun got brighter in the days of Chizkiyahu? Of course not, right? For as whereas so he's bringing about all these points here, right? That it continues to do it, and I promised we'd read through everything, but I think you're getting the gist of what he's trying to make, the point he's trying to make. For you will always find that when a great misfortune befalls a man, his eyes are darkened and the light of his sight is not clear, because the visual spirit is disturbed by the superfluity of vapors. This was their medical understanding of what happens when a person is stressed out and anxious. You don't see things, you don't look, and also because it is weak and there's not much of a consequence of the greatness of sorrow. On the contrary, when there's in joy, the soul expands and the spirit is clear, and man sees as if the light is stronger. That's why he says, "O people that dwelleth to Zion and Yerushalayim, no longer will you cry," and so on. The conclusion is, moreover, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold. So what's crazy is that, I'm sorry, crazy is the wrong word. I apologize for using that term. But some people interpret this to mean that when Mashiach comes, when Messiah comes, the sun's going to be brighter. And the Rambam is saying, no, this is all it's just poetry. That's why the Rambam emphasizes the time of the Mashiach, there's not going to be new suns in the sky and new moons in the moon. And that's not how it works. He's just saying it's going to be so much joy and so much beauty and so much peace in the world. It's going to be like the sun is shining 7 times brighter. Just like when it describes the destruction of, in the day of the Lord bindeth up the brood of the people, and he's so on and so healeth the stroke of their wound. Rambam emphasizes in Mishnah Torah, it's not like when people get struck on the hand, they won't get sick, right? They'll still get sick. You still need to put a Band-Aid on, right? But the world will be a place of peace. There will be less people fighting, less people getting bruised, less people, so on and so forth. He refers to their being raised from the fall caused by the wicked Sancheiriv, right? Right, which was what happened after, miraculously, the people under Chizkiyahu's leadership were saved from Sancheiriv, and Chizkiyahu managed to rebuild the kingdom, etc. As for his words, as the light of 7 days, the commentators have said that he means thereby the multiplicity of light. For the Hebrews denote multiplicity by the number 7. However, it occurs to me that he refers to the 7 days of the dedication of the temple. Right? When he says that the light will be sevenfold, it doesn't mean that there's going to be 7 times the amount of sunlight. It means that we're going to rededicate the temple, right? Because the 7 days the temple was dedicated. For the religious community had never had such good fortune, happiness, and joy as in those days. He said accordingly that their good fortune and happiness will be then as it was in those 7 days. So that's why he says the sun will be sevenfold. So all these are, he's really making the same point over and over again, but throughout it, we're just giving us a little, it's helping our souls, lifting our souls with some of the beautiful words, both beautifully, wonderfully happy, and unfortunately, some of them horrifically sad, but all trying to bring our emotions into these events that Yeshayahu was talking about. When he described the destruction of wicked Edom, he writes, their slain shall be cast out, the stench of their, and all the host of heaven shall molder away, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. Does anyone look back to the destruction of Edom, which occurred, at the hands of the Babylonians, right? That the people look back and say that and see, did the heavens change or anything? No, there's no astronomers I'm aware of that have done such studies, right? Because we know what Isaiah meant, right? I just turned the page to 340. Consider, you who are able to see, whether there is anything in these texts that is obscure or leads one to imagine that he describes a future state of the heavens, that Isaiah was actually discussing the heavens, right? Remember the importance of all of this, aside from just impressing upon us the power and beauty of Yeshayahu's words, right? But the point of this all is that you have to really understand, when you're reading the Torah, when you're reading the words of the prophets, right? It's obvious that it wasn't meant to be taken as a literal description of what's going to happen, right? So when the Rambam is going to go ahead later and to take verses which seem to indicate something that the Rambam has told us is not correct, and he's going to interpret it to us in a way that isn't literal, he's going to tell us, don't tell me that I'm not being true, faithful to the words of the Torah, because I've showed to you that this is the way the Torah is supposed to be read, right? It's supposed to be read in a way that the words are 100% true, but they're not meant to be taken literally. So that's why he's laying this out by showing to you that it's impossible for a sane, it's an honest person to actually think that these are meant to be taken literally. So whether this description is anything but a parable signifying the end of their dynasty, the withdrawal of God's protection from them, ill luck befalling them, and the shrinking away of the position of their great dignitaries, all being due to happen within a very short time and with very little effort. It is as if he said that individuals who are like the stars, because of their fixed position, they think they're so great, like the stars in the sky, the nobles of Babylon and the fighters and generals of Assyria. They think they're so great, right? Right? Because of their high rank and their remoteness from change, would fall down with a very short time, as a leaf falleth off from the vine, and so on. They're just going to fall off just like a grape leaf. When it dries out at the end of the season, it falls off just like everything else, right? This is too clear even to be mentioned in a treatise like this. Rambam would say, I don't even know why I'm wasting my time describing this. It's so obvious, right? This treatise here I'm writing is for smarter people that need to be told something like this. Nor then should be expiated upon some. I'm not even going to say any more. He already spent 2 pages expiating on it, but okay, fine. Now I'm done, right? But necessity requires this. I have to say this anyway for the common people, because so many people, the common folk, and even some of those who are supposed to belong to the elite, right, who think of themselves as intelligent, educated rabbis, right, they use this verse as a proof without considering what becomes before it and after it, and without paying attention to the context in which it occurs, as if it contained information given to us in the Torah about the end of the heavens, that they actually think that Yeshayahu was predicting that one day the heavens are gonna end, right? Just as there's given to us in it information about their coming to be, and they're going to come and go and so on. So this whole thing is all messed up, the Rambam is saying. You have to look at what Yeshayahu is trying to teach, understand what he's teaching in its context, and then understand that what he's really talking about. He's not predicting an end of the world. Now remember, the Rambam understood, and I have to make this again clear, the Rambam understood that according to the laws of physics, the universe has to always continue, right? Because the laws of physics dictate that a world like the one that you and I see should be the way we see it, right? So therefore, those same laws have to exist all the time and will always exist. Had the Rambam had a different understanding of physics, he would have discussed something else. But in the Rambam's scientific mind, the end of the universe is an impossibility, right? Just like in Aristotle's scientific mind, the creation of the universe is a scientific impossibility, which the Rambam then argued on, and we already went through that in depth. So I'm not going to review it now again. Again, when Isaiah began to give Israel, even he said he's not going to expiate on it, he's going to continue doing it. But let's go for it, right? Again, when Isaiah began to give Israel the good tidings about the destruction of Sancherib and of all the nations and the kings that were with him, as is well known, and the victory that would be won over them with the help of God and no one else, he said to them, speaking in parables, see how those heavens are rent, this earth worn out, and how those who live on it die away while you are succored. It is as if he said that those who have extended over the whole earth and were thought to be as firmly established as the heavens. We look at things, any of us that lived through the end of the Soviet Empire, would have experienced something like this, right? Who would have thought that if I told you in 1978 that one day the Soviet Empire was going to go poof, like that, in a few months it's going to go kaput. Who would have thought such a thing, right? No one would have thought such a thing. They thought, oh, maybe Americans are going to be stronger. Maybe Soviets are going to lose this or win that, lose this, lose that. No one would have thought it'd just go kaput. But so that's what happened, and that's what that's what he's saying. That Yeshayahu was saying. You think the Assyrian kingdom is so mighty and so strong? Hang in there. A generation after Yeshayahu, the whole thing was gone. The Babylonians conquered them, finished. Assyria was a memory, and now it's an archaeological site, right? And that's the end of it, right? So with the in the beginning of the passage, he says, "For the Lord hath comforted Zion; He hath comforted all her waste places." This I want to read inside. So give me a minute. This is Isaiah 51. I want to read inside because it's just so beautiful. Ki nicham Hashem Tzion, because God has comforted Zion, right? Nicham kol chavoseh, He has comforted all of her destroyed places. Vayasem idbara ke'eden, He made a wilderness like beautiful like Eden. V'yarvasa kigan Adonai, and the wilderness is now like a garden of God. Sason v'simcha yimatzeh ba, happiness and joy will be found in her. Todah, thankfulness, v'kol zimran, the sound of song, right? The and then he continues, Akshivu elai ami, listen to me, my nation, ulumi elai hazinu, my people, listen, pay attention to me. Ki Torah me'iti teitze, the Torah comes from me, God says, umishpati, and my justice, l'or amim argia, I am going to bring it as a light unto the nations of the world. Karov tzidki yatzarishi, and it goes on beautiful things, and then that's just absolutely one of the most wonderful chapters in Isaiah ends. Su'ul hashamayim einechem, raise your eyes up to the heavens, v'abitu el haaretz, and then look at the earth, mitachas, that's below you. Ki shamayim ke'ashan nimlachu, because the heavens are going to melt away like smoke, because smoke just dissipates. V'haaretz kabeged tifla, and the land like a cloak will just eventually get worn out. V'yoshveh, and its residents, kimochen yimusun, the people that live upon earth will die. However, God says, Vishuasi, my salvation, the olam tia, lasts forever. V'tzidkasi, and my righteousness, lo techot, will never become lessened, will never go away, or will never be broken, depending on how you translate it. But beautiful stuff. So here you have God is telling you, does anyone really think that the heavens are going to vanish like smoke? Is that what Isaiah means? I mean, who thinks that that's what he means? I mean, somebody might, but Rambam is saying, like, that's not what he means, right? I mean, to each one of us, those powerful words meant something. And probably each of us took it and heard it in a different way. But I doubt that any one of us thought that Isaiah was trying to tell us a scientific fact that one day the heavens were going to disappear, right? If anyone did, raise your hand. I'll throw you out. No, I'm kidding. but that's what the Rambam is saying. Then he keeps on going. With regard to the return of the King of Israel, talking about the Messiah himself, his stability and his permanence, the fact that the reign of Mashiach will be forever, he says that God will produce anew the heavens and the earth. For in his speech, so here we'll go to Isaiah 51 again, because again, this is beautiful stuff, and I apologize. I personally have a very soft spot in my heart for the prophet Isaiah. But he says, oh, Isaiah 51:16. Let's read them. Because these verses are just absolutely beautiful. V'asim dvarai beficha, right? I will put my words in your mouth, right? Uvitzel yadichi sisicha, and I will shelter you in the shade of and the protection of my hand. Linto hashamayim, to plant the skies with these soraretz and build a foundation for the earth. V'lei mor l'tzion, and to tell the people of Zion, Ami ata, you are my people. Now, does this mean that so again, what God here is saying is that the kingdom of the future, the kingdom of the ultimate redemption, is something that will last forever, because the justice and righteousness of God is something that lasts forever. He's not saying this, as astronomical instructions about the creation of the heavens of the earth. With regard to the permanence of the possession of Israel of kingly rule, and to the latter's departure from the great and celebrated potentates, he says, for the mountains shall depart, and so on. With regard to the permanence of the king that is the Mashiach, and to Israel's kingdom not being destroyed, he says, thy sun shall no more go down, and so on. It's funny how this is not the first time the Rambam says, I'm not going to talk about this anymore. And then he goes on for another 2 pages and talks about it. But okay, it's all good. Anyway, he's allowed. It's his book. He can write what he wants. So after that, Isaiah goes on in his speech consistently using those figurative expressions, for they appear thus to him who understands the meaning of those speeches. Thus describing the state of exile when he's referring to Gaulis, when he's referring to exile and its various particularities, and thereupon the restoration of the kingdom. He says again, speaking in parables, I'll sure create another heaven and another earth, and those that are now will be forgotten, their traces effaced. Thus he explains in this continuity, saying, I shall create. He doesn't mean that there's going to be new heavens and new earths. He means there's going to be new realities. The people are going to go from one place to another, and new realities will constantly, new sorrows and hardships, right, will happen in between. And then we'll recover from one sorrow and rebuild. And then when we have another hardship, we recover from that and rebuild. A state of, but in the future, it'll be a state of constant joy, so former sorrows will not be remembered. Listen to the arrangement of the notions and the mutual connection of the verses indicating these notions. How in the first beginning of these passages says, I will make mention of the loving kindness of the Lord and the praise of the Lord. Then he describes the bounties that he bestows upon us, and he bore them and carried them all the days of old, and so on. Then he describes our disobedience, but they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. This is Yeshayahu 63. The Rambam is giving us a quick rundown of Parak, the 63rd chapter of Yeshayahu. Also beautiful Parak. I would read it, but in the interest of time, I'll keep rolling. Our adversaries have trodden down thy sanctuary wherever. Then he intercedes. Be not wroth very sore, O Lord, or what immediately follows. Then he sets forth how we have deserved the great misfortunes that have befallen upon us. Because having received the call to truth and having not responded, he says, I offered myself to be sought of them, and that asked not for me. In other words, Hashem says, I came to you with prophets, and I taught you, and I told you. Then he promises pardon and pity. Thus saith the Lord, and what immediately follows. I just turned to 342. Then he follows, and I'm just kind of running through this. This is the text of what he says, and he shall call his servants by another name, so that he who blesseth himself in the earth shall bless himself by the God of truth. And so on and so on until he create Jerusalem with rejoicing and people of joy. Accordingly, so I kind of ran through the first paragraph, and I encourage you just to open Yeshayahu 63 and 65 and just read the chapters in there. The bottom line being that all of these metaphors are meant as a poetic way of expressing these very grand ideas about the future, about posterity, about suffering, about all of these things, right? Accordingly, the whole matter, for after saying, for behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, he immediately explains this by saying, for behold, I create Jerusalem rejoicing in her people of joy. So you see from the juxtaposition that a new heaven just means the rebuilding of Jerusalem. It doesn't mean, and no one, maybe somebody thinks that when Mashiach comes, when the Messiah comes and establishes a kingdom in Jerusalem, there will be a new heaven. But the Rambam is saying that's ridiculous, right? It means that the rebuilding of Jerusalem is like a new heaven. It's not a new. The point being, the Rambam is saying there's no new laws of physics that all of a sudden come into play when the redemption happens. The laws of physics remain exactly the same as they are today, and Rambam is really trying to drive that point home because, unfortunately, in many circles, people think that that's not the case, and the Rambam is trying to make sure we understand that. After this preamble, he says, just as those states of faith and joy, and that faith which I promised you to create will also be permanently established. For the faith in God and the joy in that faith are states that cannot cease or ever be altered in all those who have attained them. That's something that's permanent. When we feel in our hearts, right, a love of God, that's something that no matter what happens outside of us, it's a permanent thing. And therefore, he says, just as this faith and of joy in it, as to which I promise that it will extend over the earth, will be firm, established, and permanent, so will your progeny and your name endure. Okay? That is a statement which follows. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. When he wants to talk to us about permanence, he talks to us about emunah, about belief in God, faith in God, and the joy that comes about with that, which is something that's solid, that can never be taken away. For it sometimes happens that the seed remains while the name does not. Thus you can find many peoples that are called the seed of Persia or Greece, but are not known by a special name, being absorbed into another religious community. This, in my mind, is likewise an indication of the eternity of the Torah, because of which we have a special name. All right. So again, this is all really, really nice stuff. And I really wish I could have gotten through this chapter, but there's no way. But I'm sorry. A lot of the really cool stuff that I told you in the beginning we would do, like Rambam's treatment of Bereshis, of Genesis, and how to reconcile science with Genesis. I know that's a massive question, and I kind of held it out there as a bait to keep everyone listening the whole time. But that he hits that on the bottom of 344, and we're just not going to get there tonight. I'm sorry, but anyway, let's keep going. We'll do a little farther. So then, in as much as these figures, so don't think Rambam says that it's just Isaiah who speaks in parables, right? Right? Isaiah happens to be the best example because he's grand and has these beautiful, beautiful poetic language to describe things. But everybody does, and now he's going to start bringing. If you look at the references at the bottom, you could see who he's going to bring: Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, Micah, Haggai, at Tehillim, Devarim, okay, all Habakkuk, all of those, all of those, all of those prophets. And if that's not enough for you, then forget about it. Then you just might as well find a different class. But that's got to be enough prophets to prove that all the prophets always speak in this type of metaphoric language. So here goes with the examples. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to keep going back and forth and pulling up the Hebrew, but you can look it up if you want to. All the references are there. Inasmuch as these figurative expressions occur in Isaiah, I have examined all of them, right? However, they also occur in sometimes in the speech of others. Thus, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, when describing the destruction of Jerusalem caused by the sins of our forefathers, says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was waste and void, and so on, right? He wasn't talking, God wasn't saying that the world was void. He's saying God looked at the world and he saw there are a bunch of sinners, right? Ezekiel describing the ruin of the kingdom of Egypt and the destruction of Pharaoh at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, when Yechezkel was speaking a specific prophecy that Nebuchadnezzar was going to defeat the Egyptians, which is a historical event that did occur after that prophecy. He says, and when I shall extinguish thee, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof black. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. All the bright lights of heaven will I make black over thee. It said so on and so forth. So clearly Ezekiel was not talking, and nobody, as far as I know, has recorded such an event happening other during that historical battle. Joel, the prophet Joel, the son of Pethuel, speaking of the multitude of locusts, he said, before them the earth quaketh and the heavens tremble, and the sun and the moon have become black. Okay, you don't need me to describe it. Amos, describing the destruction of Shomron, of Samaria, says that I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in the clear day, and I will turn your feasts, and so on. Okay, by the way, in Maimonidean tradition, the famous miracle of Yoshua about the sun stopping in the Ayalon during the battle, right? The several Maimonidean commentaries describe that it was based themselves on this Rambam's understanding here. Rambam doesn't say explicitly regarding that one that it wasn't the pshat, that there was no actual miracle that the sun stopped. I understand that there are others that understand that there was a miracle, but I'm just telling you how the Ralbag says this there. But he says that it was, the miracle was that the victory was so complete that it was as if they had an entire day, right? It was usually in those days, battles always took place in the daytime. At night, everyone went to sleep. In the morning, they woke up and battled again, right? So keeping the sun longer, right, gives you more time to defeat the enemy. So if you're losing a battle, you want the sun to go down. So it was such a decisive victory that it was as if the sun stayed out longer. It would be how Maimonides, according to those commentaries, would understand that kind of miracle. And the Rambam will deal with miracles soon, and I promise you we'll get there next week. At the end of this chapter, he deals with miracles and with Bereshis, and it's gonna be really cool. But we're not gonna do it today. So I'm glad. It's like, when you're watching a good show and it says to be continued at the best part, so I'm sorry about that. But anyway, Amos. So, okay, I just read that. Micah, okay, if you don't have enough from Micha, the prophet says as follows, referring to the ruin of Shomron. For behold, the Lord come out and will down, and the mountains shall be molten, and so on. Haggai, referring to the fall of the kingdom, right? The prophet Haggai. So the Persians that meet, I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and so on. And during Yoav's expedition against Edom, right? So here we're now in scripture. The Navi begins to describe the weakness and lowly state of the religious community, right? as it was before. So this is from Tehillim. The event happened during the time of David, but this verse that he's quoting is from Psalms, from Tehillim. Thou hast made the earth to shake, thou hast cleft it, healed the branches thereof, for it tottered. Right? In order to signify that we should have no fear when the nations are destroyed and perish, inasmuch as we put our trust in his help and not in our fighting and our strength, being, as it says, a people saved by the Lord. It says, therefore we will not fear, right? Um, though the earth do change and though the mountains be moved into the heart of the seas. Right? What does that mean? It means just like you see, even though you might see other nations getting destroyed around you, you don't be afraid. It doesn't mean that the earth actually changes. The point being, again, that it doesn't mean that the laws of nature change. The laws of nature are fixed. Right? In the description of the drowning of the Egyptians, the waters saw thee, they were in pain, the depths also trembled, the voice of thy thunder, and so on. Similarly, the Song of Devorah, the earth trembled, and so on. There occur many passages of this kind. Draw an analogy from what has been mentioned to what has not. In other words, I'm done, right? Although he's not done. But again, he's going to do the same thing in another paragraph. But I said enough. I said I already brought you too many examples, right? So if you find me, go ahead, open Tanakh, find another Navi, find another prophecy that he said or she said, and you'll see that there's metaphor and they speak in all of this grand language, but it doesn't actually be meant literally to say that the sun and the moon are going to disappear or whatever. Okay, so the Shiras Devora, he mentioned for a second, and it brought up something that came up to me this week, an idea that connects to the Daf Yomi. So I hope you grant me the allowance to describe something not in the Mor Nevuchim directly. But give me one more second. Um, this next paragraph I'll just go through real quick and then we'll stop. As for the passage in Joel, remember I told you, Rambam says I'm going to stop, and then he says it brings another example. So as for Joel, I will show wonders in the heavens and the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood, for the great and terrible day of the Lord will come, and so on and so forth. According to me, Rambam couldn't help himself, right? He just kept thinking of examples that he wants to tell us how he explains that particular prophecy. So that prophecy in Joel, Rambam is telling us pshat in the psukim in Joel right now, right? So I'm telling you that what he's describing is the destruction of Sancheirav before Yerushalayim. Remember, Sancheirav destroyed the northern kingdom. Then he came and destroyed most of the southern kingdom of Yehuda. He destroyed all the towns in Yehuda. Everyone gathered, all the refugees gathered in Yerushalayim under Chizkiyahu, who held out to Sancheirav's siege, right? Until eventually there was a huge miracle on the night of Pesach that 185,000 troops in Sancheirav's army suddenly died, and Sancheirav withdrew back to Assyria. So he's saying that this thing in Yoel is describing that event in history. If, however, you don't always to accept this, if you don't like my pshat in Yoel, I'll tell you there's another explanation. Maybe he's talking about the war of Gog before he talked time of Mashiach, right? Maybe he's talking about a different war. There's going to be a huge war with terrible destruction, terrible loss in life, and in the end, some miracle is going to destroy the enemy, and it's going to be over. Or perhaps you will say, how can the day of destruction of Sancheirav be called the great and terrible day of the Lord, right? So know, therefore, that every day in which a great victory or great disaster comes to pass, it's always called the great and terrible. Very often, it's described as terrible, even when it's talking about the destruction of wicked people, right? Terrible just means incredibly terrible. I mean, it's terrible, a terrible loss of life, and it strikes terror in the hearts even of those who aren't the ones being killed, because when you see such awful death and destruction, it strikes the terror in anyone's heart, whether they're your enemy or your friend, right? Thus Joel said of the day when the locusts come, for great is the day of the Lord and very terrible, who can abide by it, and so on. All right, so that kind of ends finally the Rambam's little tour of all of Tanakh, his examples where he's trying to drive home the point that nowhere in Tanakh does it ever say, according to the Rambam, that nature will change. Nature will not change. The laws of nature are the way they are. And anytime you see a prophet talking about the heavens crashing into the earth or whatever, they're using metaphor, and that's it. And if you don't agree, then fine. But that's what the Rambam said. Okay. So now I want to say something else. If you let me share for 2 minutes, I told this over. I was in shul the other day. So in my shul here in Birmingham, after davening on Shabbos morning, we have a kiddush, and I have the custom to teach the haftorah. So this past Shabbos, but the week before, we read the Shira, and the haftorah was the Shira's Devora, right? It was the song of Devora, which she sang in after the victory against Sisera, right? And the general Sisera, and who in battle. So right before that episode of the battle and the victory in battle and what happened in the song, there was a little curious episode that always kind of like made me wonder, but I think I figured it out. So the episode goes as follows. Devorah is a prophetess. She was a known established prophet, right? And she called Barak, right? Barak ben Avinoam, and said, I heard, in prophecy, that Sisera is going to lead his band of, Canaanites to such and such place. And you go and lead the Israelites, muster up the people of Israel, go and lead the battle against him, and you'll defeat him. All right. So Barak had a very curious reaction. And he says to Devorah, he says, if you come with me, I'll go. If you don't come with me, not going. So So the way I always understood it, and the simple way of understanding it, is Barak was, he was afraid, and he figured if he has the prophet there, she's got a direct line to God, right? It'll help him win, she'll pull up some miracles, I don't know, do something, make something happen, and she'll win, and he'll win. But then her response is even more curious. Her response to him is, uh, I'll go with you, right? But just know that now that you asked that I should go, right? That you're not going to get credit for this victory, and everyone's going to say that Sisera was defeated by a woman. So the simple understanding is that she's saying, you have lack of faith, right? So the Israelites need a victory. God decided that we're going to win, so we'll go and win. But it won't. But you could have gotten credit. Forget it. Now everyone's going to say it's in the hands of a woman, and in those days, that was an insult, right? To be beaten by a woman. So it's still an insult today at war. I mean, women have not yet achieved that kind of equality in war making. So it would still be embarrassing for many people to say you were defeated by a woman. All right. So the story, whatever, it's interesting. You can read it and always kind of. But then I was reading through the Gemara on Tzaddik Gimel and Bava Kama, which we learned together maybe about a little over a week ago. And the stories go one by one. The Gemara talks about different folk sayings. Rava, it brings the different folk sayings, and he tries to find places in Tanakh which support those folk sayings, which show, and the folk sayings usually have some, kernel of wisdom in them. And you say, well, where in Tanakh do we see a source for this piece of wisdom that we find in this saying that people say in the street? And one of the folk sayings goes as follows. If somebody comes to you and says, somebody's walking, he has a big package, it's really heavy, and he comes to you on the street and he says, Joe, could you help me schlep this into my back of my car, right? So you tell him, you know what? If you help me, like, you're asking me for a favor. If we do it together, sure, I'll do it, right? But if you come to me and tell me, could you put this in the back of my car for me, and you're not going to help, forget it. I'm not going to help you, right? So that's how the folk saying goes. The Aramaic had a little kind of rhymey rhythm to it, but whatever. That was the point. The point being, when somebody comes to ask you a favor, right, and they're not willing to roll up the sleeves and do it themselves, they just want you to do all the work, you're not likely to want to help them, right? But if you see somebody struggling and trying to get into his car, then sure, then you'd be happy to help, right? Anyway, so Rava says, what's the source? He brings this verse over here from Barak and Devorah, right? Where Barak says, if you come with me, I'll go. If you don't come with me, I won't go. So right away, it struck me. How is Rava looking at this exchange? Rava is looking at this exchange very differently than I originally understood it. Rava is looking at it as if, first of all, Barak doesn't trust her. And I'm going to throw something in here for a minute. Partly doesn't trust her as a prophet because she's a woman, right? There aren't very many female prophets running around. And Baruch doesn't trust her. Maybe she's not such a good prophet. The last prophet was a guy, he was much more powerful. I don't necessarily believe this woman prophet here, right? So he says, if you're willing to come along with me, so what are you gonna do? You're gonna send me to my death? I'm fighting this mighty army. And by the way, when you learn through the story, you see that the strategy was extremely poor, right? Baruch, it was just, the whole thing was a mess. This totally miraculous victory, right? And so Baruch is saying, you're sending me to my death. You know what? If you're willing to come along with me and put your money where your mouth is, right? Then I'll see that you're telling me the real thing. You're telling me the truth, right? And then I'll see that then I'll be willing to fight. But if you're just going to send me to my death and my soldiers to my death, forget about it. I'm not interested. I don't trust that you're really such a prophet. And remember, we've seen it in the Rambam before. It's a mitzvah that we're obligated to listen. An established prophet, it's a mitzvah to listen to what they command us to do in the name of God, which Devorah explicitly did. So Devorah's answer to him now makes so much sense. She says, you should have had emunah in me, right? I told you a nevuah from God. You should have had emunah. You would have gotten the credit because you would have had the faith to go to battle, right? Based on the words of a prophet. And all the credit would have been yours because it was against reason, right? Because you were fulfilling the word of God through the prophet. But now that you don't believe me, I'll go with you. You'll see, and you'll fight, and you'll fight with me at your side. However, everyone is going to say, right, that it was through the hands of a prophet who was a woman, right? Because you didn't think that I could be a prophet because I'm a woman. Everyone will know that even though I was a woman, I'm still a prophet, and you still should have listened. Anyway, so Rava gave a really good way of understanding that whole story that I thought kind of brought light to the whole thing. So I know that was totally off topic, but the Rambam did mention the Song of Devorah, so that was my excuse to say it. But I wanted to share it, so I just did. Anyway, we have about 6 minutes for questions if people want to bring anything up.
Let me actually tie it to what we just learned. What we just learned is about how nature isn't going to change, right?
Right.
And Malbim says on the curse for the stars Meroz and Yoshvea that they were commanded by God to intervene. It says, right? And Rambam says the laws of physics won't change. So that miracle is exactly what you just talked about. That if you want to involve God, there will be miracles and it will happen. If you don't want to involve God,
there won't be. Yeah, well, yeah, he will address miracles soon, very soon, on page 345. It's not going to be his only time he addresses miracles in this book. We'll have several opportunities to do so, but his first serious treatment of how miracles work, despite his insistence that the laws of nature don't change, he is going to deal with, and Bli Neder will get to there next week. And hopefully next week we'll get to that and how he ends chapter 29, where he discusses the apparent how to reconcile contradictions between science and the description of the creation of the world in Genesis. Both of those we will get to. And I'm sorry we didn't get to it today, but it's a long chapter. And we could blame it on the Rambam because, and since he knows I'm joking, I'll say this, right? That he decided, despite his own protestations and saying he's not going to drag on, he dragged on. So what could I do? We did it. All right. So he said it twice and then continued. So whatever, it's all good. Anyway, so that's today, and thank you for joining. Any other questions before we close out for the night?
Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.